Усім привіт! Будемо розпочинати нашу публічну програму. Це лекція Маріуша Чепчинського «Монументальні ландшафти», яка відбувається сьогодні в рамках проєкту міжнародної резиденції Донбаських студій «Ландшафт як монумент», ініційованої фондом «Ізоляція» за підтримки Українського культурного фонду. Ми маємо можливість, власне, вже третій тиждень говорити про культурні ландшафти, екологічні практики в сучасному мистецтві, критику антропоцену разом з художниками. Сьогодні з нами лектор Маріуш Чепчинський, власне, культурний географ, професор кафедри просторового менеджменту університету Гданська, незалежний консультант і дослідник міста. Власне, інтерес Маріуша – це якраз культурний ландшафт, який є результатом культурного освоєння простору, власне, просторовість культури. Сьогодні більше поговоримо про різні аспекти комеморації, пам'яті, трохи поговоримо про міста, не тільки про міста і про, власне, політику ландшафту. Отже, я думаю, що скажу ще декілька слів про сам проект. Резиденція відбувається за підтримки Українського культурного фонду і, на жаль, в цьому році через карантинні обмеження ми вимушені проводити її в онлайні, але для нас це можливість якраз залучити міжнародних учасників і залучити, скажімо, учасників зі сходу України, які в той чи іншій мірі не могли б приєднатися фізично за таких умов. Отже, ми дуже раді, що зараз вже йде третій тиждень цієї резиденції. І перед тим, як передати слово Маріушу, я коротко, мабуть, скажу ще про регламент цієї лекції. Власне, вступна лекція до теорії, можна сказати, ландшафту. Вона відбуватиметься десь приблизно 30-40 хвилин. Ми поговоримо. Власне, доповідь зробить Маріуш, він підготував сьогодні презентацію. І потім буде можливість поставити питання, тобто буде сесія Q&A. І ми озвучимо всі питання, приєднуйтесь до обговорення. Власне, можна прочитати тему і зазначені питання в описі події. So, I will switch briefly into English. Mariusz, the word is yours. So we're happy to have you with us with our program. And please, the word is yours.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor. It's a pleasure. I would rather be physically with you in Kiev, but coming with the circumstances, we do what we can do, and what we can do our best. As you said earlier, Dimitri, I will let me first have my presentation ready. Okay. Okay. I will speak about landscapes. As a geographer, I found landscape as my major topic of studies, and since I grew up in Poland and I traveled quite a lot around post-communist countries, this post-communism will be still very visible. So in the most of the pictures, like 90%, are mine. This is last September in Bishkek, formerly known as Frunze, with Lenin Monument, standing behind, not in front of the former Lenin Museum, with a lovely red star being relatively well kept. And of course, even now, this landscape speaks about the society. I would like to start my presentation with concept of American sociologist. Can you hear me? Yep, I hope so. Yeah. A concept of American sociologist Ted Schatzky and his theory of practice, when generally Schatzky said that people do what makes sense to them. And I will come back to this concept of sense towards the end of my lecture. But Schatzky said that practices are those spatial and temporal actions and projects, and we do what we think makes sense. So, like on the left side, you can see the monument of a totally forgotten Bavarian poet of early 19th century, decorated with flowers and the pictures of Michael Jackson. Because Michael Jackson, when he was in Munich, he was staying in a hotel outside this picture, this monument. So that monument's got a second life and second meaning. There's a whole row of different monuments. Only this one is really nicely kept and decorated. While on the picture below, you might recognize a charming, typical Khrushchevka buildings from early 60s on the main street of Kaliningrad, which has been decorated or historicized for the World Football Championship. And they've got this almost chateau kind of European, Western European look. Some of them are neo-Renaissance, some of them are neo-Gothic. When I was there last September, I've been there before, I couldn't recognize the main street. And they are typical Khrushchevka, so if you go beyond, you could see this. But for the people there, it clearly makes sense. We have to look for the senses why they did it. So since I would like to speak, as also a part of your residency, is about changes and transformations. And we live in a probably fast-changing world. Zygmunt Bauman would call it liquid modernity or post-modernity, when everything flows and the changes are going very, very rapidly. So I would like to speak about three of the major turns or changes that influence social sciences, at least in the probably in the US, UK, and Western Europe, but also in Poland and many other countries. So at first, I would like to speak about a semiotic term. When we speak about the meaning of signs, when the meaning becomes significant, becomes something to be researched, so adding meaning to our life. But meaning is also related with situated knowledge and positions. I will go back to this later on. There's a small quotation of Nietzsche, but recently in Poland, we have quite a big debate about rainbow flags. Probably 20 years ago in Poland, definitely 30 years ago, rainbow meant rainbow, or probably heaven. But now rainbow is considered as being LGBT ideology, as the right-wing party says. So there was this lovely decoration on Salvator Square in Warsaw showing the rainbow in front of the Salvator Church. Apparently the artist didn't have anything gay or queer in mind, but the rainbow was burned a few times and eventually was removed. And recently, after beating some of the LGBT activists in Warsaw, the Palace of Culture and Science, which is municipally managed in Warsaw, has got the rainbow colors on the top picture, which is again adding meaning or changing meaning. The second term is a cultural term. So culture is also one of those traveling concepts, as Nike Ball called it, when it's changed from material, from education, from many different things towards system of communication or a signifying system. When it's a system of signs to be shared by a similar group of people. When I saw first the building on the top, I thought it's such a lovely Stalinistic building, but that's Edificio España, that's building in central Madrid, built by a Franco regime in late 40s, early 50s. Not really Stalinistic, but it looks Stalinistic for me, because for me this sign means Stalinist very, very strongly. So if we look at culture as a system of communication based on similar coding and decoding of similar signs. So if we are a coherent culture group, it means that we similarly or on the same way understand the same codes. If this building on the top looks Stalinistic for you as well, it means that we share this strong post-socialist, fate or shadow. And then the last of the turns, my favorite one, is the landscape turn. Probably again 20, 30 years ago, probably 30 years ago, landscape have different meaning than we think about landscape now. And I will speak about this a bit later on. For me, this landscape is this composition or amalgamate of forms, functions, and meaning, and they are dynamic. Although forms didn't change that much, functions change sometimes, and meanings change in every culture group, or in every few years, or sometimes I read a book, I know something, and the same object or building has got a different meaning. So the landscape is the result or outcome of what we can call culturalization of space, or a spatialized culture, so culture in space. On a top picture, which looks like a lovely Gothic city, that's my city Gdansk with St. Mary's Church, but most of those buildings here, they are from 1960s and 1950s and 1960s. The city was heavily destroyed during the war. So the walls of the church survived, but the roof collapsed. So it's only reconstruction, and below is my birthplace. Well, not the castle. There's a hospital near there in Marburg or Marienburg. When again, the tower of the castle I'm afraid, is younger than me. I'm older than the tower's castle. The castle comes from 1970s, but there's a lot of interpretation, and there's this kind of traveling concept of landscape, starting with view and probably and region, going through the idea, especially German tradition of Karl Ritter, then going to a lifestyle and a French tradition, a French school of paysage studies. The Berkeley School was focused on materiality with Karl Sauer, and the New Cultural Geography, which is focused on meanings and text and interpretations, significance, values. So it's all there, but it can be understood differently. I will mostly focus on this New Cultural Geographic meaning of the concept of landscape, of cultural landscape. I found the concept of landscape very appealing and very useful, because it's for me one of the best holistic, all-comprising concept in human geography or cultural geography. At first, it includes contexts and relations. So even when you see me now, you can see the context behind my head. There are some maps, a crazy cat, some drawings, some more pictures. So the context, you could put me, Dmitro gave the introduction, which was also a kind of context, how to perceive me. If you look at any old buildings, you could see the context, historical, all different relations. The other very important element, which I found landscape very, very, very useful, a landscape is always related with the eye of the observant, or the perspective, or the position or situated knowledge. The picture on the top is the monument of the former president of Poland, Lech Kaczynski. And of course, I would have taken the picture from different perspective, but I've chosen this one. That's my eye. That's the same with this, the old port of Menton in the edge of the border of Côte d'Azur and Liguria in France. So there was my perspective with this monument at the tops of the cemetery, And okay, the lady there actually on the right side, she's kind of Polish Ukrainian duchess who died in the age of 20. Nevertheless, so that's again giving you a context of it. But then it's a perspective. I could have taken a picture from a different corner, from a different side, maybe more or less interesting. It's my concept. It's my idea. It's the same like this perspective you see behind. If you could see all my apartment here, you could see it from different angles. But I choose the perspective. I choose where I sit. This is my desk. I work here. And then the third element of landscape, which I found very useful, is interpretation. I will go to this interpretation later on, because I think this interpretative power of landscape, of building narratives, is one of the crucial. And what is very good for researchers in landscape is the landscape is or can be full of tensions between distance and proximity, observation and participation, between culture and nature, past and present or future, between something unusual, special, and something everyday or vernacular. And then we go to monumental landscapes. I love etymology, so I've started to look where the word monument comes from, and actually from Greek. It's supposed to mean to remind, advise, or warn. So it kind of allows us to see the past. Monuments are usually, or I think they're only related to the past, probably. We monumentalized past, or chosen aspect of past, and help us visualize, or keep it for the future. Or I could say monuments are kind of way of playing with the past, like playing cards. The building there on the picture is the never completed house of Soviets in Kaliningrad, which kind of looks like a robot with eyes and a mouth. It's been painted and they put glasses. When Putin and German Chancellor Schroeder were coming, I think 5 years ago for the celebration of the end of the World War. So it's kind of living ruin. It is a kind of monument, and local authority have a problem with this building because destroying it would mean to say a mega failure, and it's technically all practically impossible to use it. It's rather unstable structure. So you could see that the monuments could be a part of the social practice. Monuments, or I rather use the processual approach, monumentalization, so turning something to monument, taking something to remind us, advise, or warn, like those three charming ladies. One is clearly trying to warn, one probably tried to remind, and one tried to advise. I think the one from the left is from Yerevan, the middle, of course, is from Kiev, and the one on the right is from Tbilisi. And you can interpret them on many different levels, from different perspectives. Gender perspective, of course, their behavior, their muscles, their swords, and their dresses. I think there were many of those strong mothers' monuments in the former Soviet Union. We didn't really have them in Poland, which is kind of a pity. We have a huge Jesus Christ monuments, but and one or two big St. Mary's. But the one in Kaliningrad, she's just having a kind of a piece of cloth, not a sword, boring. But going back for a moment, if monument is to remind, advise, and warn, I read somewhere that the one on the left, the one from Erevan, is looking towards Ararat, a Turkish part of Armenia, and it's clearly kind of warning, don't you dare come. That's what I read in the tourist guide as this kind of interpretation. And of course, the victorious one in the Ukraine. Paul Ricoeur said that the memory or reminding something it's again another reformulating on construction of the past, that we create the past. We build, Spence called it, we build palaces of remembrance in our heads. What we want to remember, what we think it's important. If you ask any Pole whose family was coming from what is now Ukraine, every single one would say that they'll have palaces or castles there and lots of properties. There was such a great life, except it was the poorest part of what is now, or what was Poland before the war. But we try to remember, or we want to remember, only the best, the glorious part. That's the same what I remember from my family past, was being transmitted are kind of, nice stories. I don't know any failures, any major failures of my great-grandparents or of my grandfathers, just, the kind of nicer things, so the kind of maybe losses, but it means they had to own something before. But there's Tony Jude said, there's a certain palatial charm in the memory. So generally, we construct our past. The past we try to monumentalize as a social construction. It's the same with the Soviet past, with the imperial, nationalist, or whatever, however deep we want to go back. It's just a social construction. George Orwell wrote in his famous book 1984, "He who controls the past commands the future. He who commands the future controls the past." We are now in Poland facing that the textbooks are being changed, especially from the recent history. So the past is being changed, so the kind of future is being changed as well. And there's this power of the past, of monuments. It's always between what to memorize and also what to forget. We can't remember everything. We have to forget some things. Usually, if we forget the painful ones, that's usually better for most of the societies. But this past is a product of hierarchy of values, meanings, and codes of the dominant groups which decide. Recently, there was a project to renew East Side Gallery in East Berlin, when in 1990 and 1999, the mayor of Berlin invited a few hundred artists who painted murals. And there was a big discussion, what to do? I mean, mural is a mural. Like, can you restore? It's not a picture. So there were some debates, but eventually most of the most famous picture has been painted again, as you can see here. So monument is rather symbol than fact. What is very important, and I think Paul Ricoeur wrote about this, Paul Ricoeur said that it's important who remembers, what is remembered, and I would add how it's being remembered. So the mode of remembrance. So then how comes the role of, I call them heritage engineers, or monumentalists, if you want to say, those signifiers, those who find something valuable. That's on the bottom picture on the left, you could see the major party building in Minsk, the Square of Independence. But I was there 2 years ago. It was very interesting because the metro station had a still old name of Revolution. So I left the metro on Revolution Square, went above the ground, and there was Independence Square. Sometimes written in Russian, sometimes written in Belarusian. So it was quite confusing when this one square had 3 names. Of course, it was also very interesting what is being remembered and who decides. And I have a small collection of sitting on Lenin's head. That's the major Lenin monument from Bucharest, stored in a suburban park in Mongolian. If that's the way of remembering Lenin, that also shows how I remember or how I want to remember this. I wasn't really big fond. I was never fond of the communist system or socialist system in Poland. But then, who remembers what is remembered and how is remembered? It becomes very crucial. That's another important element. It's nice to take into consideration this monumental politics or politikings, the three elements of policies. So policy as the plan or an action, politics as social relations, and polity as the form of organization. So monuments or monuments making or monumentalization is usually a result of those three elements, or at least two of them. On the picture below is the main square of Astana in a very cold October 1st last year, and the only three people there were three Polish people from southern Poland, surprisingly. Okay, there was me and my German colleague as well. But the Astana major squares of representations, they are very interesting monuments of the future to be remembered as the expression or representation of social relations, clearly of a plan of the group or individual, and a certain representation of form of governance. There are two more terms I'd like to introduce as well. One is cultural memory. Michel Foucault said that memory is representation of the past and could be a important political resource. Assmann and Čaplíka said that cultural memory exists in two modes: actuality, how is it contemporary used, but also potentiality in the archives, sometimes in our heads. I wrote a paper a couple of years ago about heritage resurrection, when old German heritages in southern Baltic, in Gdansk, and but also in Kaliningrad or Klaipėda, they look like there's nothing there for tens of years. And then in the 1990s, they resurrected like phoenix from ashes. So there is a potentiality, if you want to. And there's a growing group of the old Slavic pre-Christian beliefs potentially found somewhere in the archives. I don't know really where, but there is this kind of potentiality, sometimes very deep, sometimes could be imagined. And then, of course, the actuality. So how is it actually being used, like this Stalin's museum and memorial in Gori in Georgia. And then the other concept, kind of parallel, is the memory culture by Cornelsen, which is the broader concept that includes all the forms of representation of past different events as a collective memory, commemoration, incorporation in public space, and of course attached cultural texts. So recently renewed, very famous Cafe Moscow in East Berlin with a Sputnik on the top. Unfortunately, it's kind of renewed, but it's closed because the area is kind of deserted, unfortunately. So there's not enough customers probably. But there's a lot of texts about Cafe Moscow. You can find it in tourist guides. It's been incorporated to public space as a kind of commemoration 1970s culture. And then commemoration as the social activity that is an expression and abiding force of a group. So this collective commemoration gives or keeps the identity national, especially national now, and keeps them place in the world. Those two examples are from Kaliningrad. The picture on the left, there were many of them in the city center when they showed the pre-war pictures of how it looked like. more or less from this perspective and how it looks now. The old city is a park. It's only a cathedral being reconstructed, and the tower of the castle, of course, is not existing as well as any of the houses. While there's a very strange commemoration, absolutely textless, on the right side, which I think was the kind of commemoration to Crimea War or Donbass War. There were no signs, nothing. It was very close to the major governmental building in Kaliningrad, with those signs, which I think there were those Grigorgievkas probably, or something like that. That's only my guess. I'm not sure. I didn't dare to ask anybody. It was one of those very silent, it looks like a certain way of commemoration. Interestingly, when I entered Kaliningrad by bus from Klaipeda, on a border, when we stood, there was kind of prolonged check-out, check-in, and border control, there was one free Wi-Fi network in Russian, but the Wi-Fi network said, Krym nash, Crimea is ours. I didn't use it. I think it's, well, you can say it's another political statement. So it is possible. I will speak later on this interpretation, what I'm doing now. So that's this monumental stakeholders. We love to build monuments, and there are many actors or those involved in creating monuments. Sometimes it's a private business, like the picture on the top with the horse. That's, of course, outside the ruins of Troy. Almost original copy of the horse of Troy. Well, whatever. Well, it is a kind of, a monument. People go there, pay, a couple of liras, take pictures. Very interesting. The picture on the bottom left, it's so-called Fisherman's Village, which was the private developer. That's again Kaliningrad, private developer initiative in Kaliningrad. Private developers from Moscow, and he wanted to make this part of Kaliningrad attractive for Russian tourists. So he created a kind of like a Western Baltic Sea town. They even reconstructed a synagogue. I don't think there are many Jews in Kaliningrad left, but the synagogue was built there as well as a kind of landscape. Just behind those lovely building on the left, there are Brezhnev era blocks of flat in a horrible condition. And the picture on the left is the picture I took 2 weeks ago in Berlin. There's Royal Castle, which is pure concrete, not completed yet. I think it will be open next year. Now it's called Humboldt Forum. So there are Renaissance castles, which you are older than that's at least some of the Renaissance castles in Europe. And then again, there was a private initiative, a group of people, influential, very well linked with the parliament, with the Bundestag in the 1990s, who influenced of reconstruction the castle. And the ruins of the castle, which wasn't that heavily destroyed, was blown up in 1951, I think, to build a kind of another Stalinistic building, which was never completed. So monumentalization could be seen as a process. So the picture here, which looks like a Photoshop, I've been in Moscow a few years ago. Apparently this business center is completed, and it's not a Photoshop, even if it looks like. That's the actual picture. Again, I said, like maybe 5 years ago. Or maybe 10 actually now. I think I flew from Germany. So then again, this landscaping, especially monumental landscaping, is never stable. So it's the process of change, which on one hand is very interesting for researchers. On the other hand, it's very difficult because it's all changing. The form is changing, the meaning is changing. So you could see this as a multivocal, multifactor landscape between past and kind of different presence and the future as the imagination, or we can see the landscape as the arena. If we play our roles in cities, so this is the kind of like the stage design, like the show stage in the theater, when it's the stage is changing and we play different roles here and there. There's also a point with editing past. So as I said earlier, the past can change. Every time we remember, every time we evoke something from the past, we kind of change it, at least a little bit. So memories are being edited, as Bridget Powell said. So memory is never a true record of the past. That's a text word, a poem. That's apparently the only leftover of the Stalin memorial in Budapest, in Szabó Park. So then, of course, it becomes a much bigger problem when you go to the societies. When we cross the border, it's Greek for limes. Sharon Tsukin called it post-liminal landscapes, or liminal landscape which has crossed the limes between colonial and post-colonial, the border between communism and post-communism. Earlier, there was a border between capitalist or feudal and communist or socialist. So that's, of course, we've got lots of different monuments to do something, because each of those monuments tell the stories. They speak of the old regime. Sometimes they speak very loud, like the cathedrals, churches, royal palaces, or aristocratic palaces, and many of them have been destroyed, and monuments especially, of kings or emperors or Führers, for example. And of course, there's after liminal, after change, we are left with layers of lies, hypocrisies, failures, and not our landscapes. And this picture on the right is the monument of the Russian-Georgian friendship. But many Georgians didn't really see Russians as close friends. So the monument is abandoned. The picture in the left is the monument, Soviet Army monument in Tallinn in Estonia, and picture on the left, it's impressive. Supposed to be like the mausoleum of the major leaders of Czechoslovak Communist Party, with Clemens Gottwald being buried there, but not anymore. And there's kind of not much of use. Sometimes you can see a different reinterpretation of the monument. This is a very famous case in very close to the central parts of Sofia in Bulgaria. There's this huge park and a Soviet Army monument. And every now and then, the monument, officially they say it's being vandalized. Unofficially, it's being reinterpreted. So the picture on the top, I think it was during the Crimea War or during the Donbass War. I can't remember in one of those. And every now and then, it's. I think now they've got probably better CCTV, so it's not being that well reinterpreted. So that's this kind of post-liminal landscape cleansing. So you have to do something. At first sort acceptable and non-acceptable. The picture on the top on the left shows the removal of Felix Dzierżyński monument in central Warsaw on Dzierżyński Square in the autumn of 1989. Dzierżyński was a Polish origin founder of the Soviet secret police. He wasn't the pride of Poland, let's say. We called him Bloody Felix, Father Felix. So people were cheering the fall of the monument, drinking Soviet champagne to celebrate the symbolic end of the communism. We had only very, very few, probably 5 Lenin monuments in Poland. We never had any Stalin monuments built in Poland. That's one of the 5 Lenin monuments is now in the park, standing there. So when you think it's unacceptable to put it in a museum, we can just store it or melt it. Apparently, Stalin's memorial monument in East Berlin was melted into a fancy animals sculptures in East Berlin Zoo. That's what I've heard. So that elimination, something which you can't accept. on the left below, you can see the entrance to the metro, one of the metro stations in Tashkent. Probably 10 years ago, Uzbekistan changed alphabet into Latin. And of course, they've changed all the names. And it was one of the very, very few reminders I could find that the square was called Revolution Square, or just Revolution. Now it's Ahmed Temur Square, whose monument is standing on the location of Karl Marx monument and Stalin monument earlier on the same location. So it's elimination, and if possible, it's assimilation, incorporation in the museums, or sometimes in a kind of fancy parks, as the fancy memorabilia. Going towards the end of my presentation, I'll just show you the few major functions of landscape, of cultural landscape. So one is probably the most important for many, is cultural identity. You want to be identified with landscape. It is vital for many people to be identified with some elements of landscape. And the other one is the symbolic exchange, to show that we were great, better, more developed, richer, Western, or Eastern, or Southern, or whatever we want to be. It can be also a market resource. Landscape is also representation, so it represents societies, our aesthetics, our hopes, fears, aspirations. Landscape is an intertextuality, so it's a relation between different texts. So this picture on the bottom left with Bob the Squarepants, Donkey and Lenin in Moscow's agriculture exhibition grounds, it shows quite a nice postmodern view. And landscape as a gaze, as the perspective, as the way we look at it. The picture on the top right, it's the center of, now it's called North Macedonia, until recently it was the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, Skopje, which has all this grand aspiration to be more Greek than Greek, with the huge monument of Alexander the Great, of Alexander of Macedonia, which possibly wasn't from this part of Macedonia, but doesn't really matter. So all the center of one of the poorest countries in Europe, it's newly built, waterfront, white marble, and the main building, the biggest one, is archaeological museum. It's a perfect example of symbolic exchange and very important cultural identity. The picture below sits at the center of Warsaw, and the picture in the middle, that's the center of that's presidential building, palace, and the completed concert hall in Tbilisi in Georgia. So what I found, as I said, a landscape is a process. So Doreen Massey, especially, a British geographer, she died 2 years ago. She showed that this landscape is a product of interrelation, and it's constantly changing. And that's the picture from there was a big billboard in central Tbilisi showing the transformation of the governmental building, with these pictures at first, before the revolution, Stalinistic building, 1970s building, and now this kind of neoclassicistic building of presidential palace, and you cannot come closer than 2 kilometers, or at least 1 kilometer, to the presidential palace now. So they show this transformation. There were lots of, for me, interesting 1970s modernist buildings being destroyed in Tashkent, or Toshkent now, being replaced by white marble and blue glass. So this is this process of becoming, of ongoing formulation of social life. And as Bauman said, that we live in this fluid moments and the changing times. The picture here shows the elements of the Palace of Culture and Science in Warsaw. When it was built, it was Joseph Stalin's Palace of Culture and Science in Warsaw, and the new city center with Intercontinental Hotel and the office tower. When I asked my students, is there something missing with this guy saying Marx, Engels, Lenin? They didn't know what's missing. I mean, for me, obviously, there was a place when Stalin was there. That's very nicely covered. but Stalin was pretty well erased from memory, so they didn't know there were 4 of the major saints with Stalin closing the contact. So anyway, everything is changing fast. But because it's changing fast, because this kind of fluid modernity, we are probably at the same time, we are more afraid of future. Probably my parents, they could see themselves in 10, 20 years' time. Now, especially now with COVID, which accelerated everything, I don't know what I will do in 2 weeks' time or in a month now. I don't know if I can start academic year on October 1st at my university. I don't know if it's going to be online or not. I'm not sure I will have lectures in Germany or in Rome next semester. I don't know really. I don't know if I travel. I don't know if I will be locked down again. So in this time of uncertainties, we tend to turn back to past because at least we think that we know the past. And this is very interesting to see this very recent twist from what many people believed as the end of history. The communists pull down and that's the end of history, doesn't matter. Until that's kind of revenge of history, and the battle of the 21st century is focused on the past. William Faulkner said the past is never dead. It's not even the past, which you thought it's a past. On the picture on the left, there's the monument of probably one of the biggest kings of Belgium, King Leopold in Antwerp, which was first vandalized and now is being removed. The monuments of the American Confederates. So we are still in the process of transformation of you can say monumental dialectics or new temporality. And there's a big danger with this past and going to the past. This cultural memory can be a chimera, which in Greek mythology is a hybrid creature composed of imagination of past, present, and maybe visions of future. It's usually, for Greeks, it was an omen for disaster. It can be hardly controlled. And we can see this in Poland very well. We can see this in America. You can see it in Britain. The Brexit and the Donald Trump make America great again. It was clearly turning back to the past. Britain, Brexit, yeah, let's make Britain, rule Britannia again, like before the First World War or between the wars. I don't think it's very possible. I think that's really the omen for disaster. And that's to finish up the lecture, going back to searching senses and interpretations, because I think that's the major role of scientists and researchers. I found this graph recently on Facebook or on Instagram, some of my colleagues' shows, and that's quite nice to show the role of maybe of scientists, of interpretation, because what I was doing during the lecture when I talked about the pictures, I was trying to interpret, trying to find sense or wisdom. Of course, I can draw a unicorn out of it, but I was trying to create a making sense relation of information or knowledge, possibly related. What is important? There's a big difference between the scientific knowledge and opinion, or scientific facts, you can say, or an opinion, is that this interpretation, it can be verified and discussed. I don't say, I think it is whatever. I think this is blue. I think those build. You can discuss with what I think, really. With scientific knowledge, you can discuss. But okay, if you make sense and many other people agree in the science, yeah, okay, that's right. It has to be questionable. It has to be discursive in a sense. And the purpose of interpretation is to convince others it's possible to agree to the sense constructed by the interpreter. So that's what we are trying to look for. We try to look for different senses. That's a picture I took in Kiev many years ago. I don't know, it looks the same or it's changed. But if you try to make a sense out of this landscape, you can build different interpretations. Of course, when I show this picture, I didn't see it. When I was there, the lighting wasn't working, but I found in the internet old pictures with the rainbow light. So, of course, for many of my Western friends, the big rainbow and two half-naked men holding hands, the interpretation was more than clear, but it was wrong. It's not a gay friendship of a Ukrainian farmer and Russian steelworker, or the opposite, I don't know who is who. And historical figures looking at them. It's very interesting construction. But you're going to try to find a sense out of it, build a sense, and maybe agree or not. Sorry, I spoke too long. Thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you, Mariusz, for your thoughts. I think we start to have a Q&A session. И я скажу на русском коротко для тех, кто нуждается в переводе. У нас есть возможность переводить. Не стесняйтесь задавать свои вопросы. Также мы следим за Facebook-трансляцией. Если у вас есть вопросы и вы хотите их задать, можно их писать в Facebook-трансляции. So we have now with us 14 residents which participate in residency program. I think most of you have your questions. If not, I can start with mine. Mariusz, well, could you comment on the concept of the residency landscape as a monument? And during this during our conversation, we tried to ground this discussion to Donbass context. And could we look at this industrial landscapes, or let's say post-industrial landscape, and imagine that is a monument of human activity, and I mean, in this ecological or environmental perspective, could we look at some landscape and imagine it's like a monument? And what do you also think about this non-human perspective of memory, non-anthropocentric concept of memory, like traces, and we can imagine that this trace in Donbass, it's well-known terracones or waste bins, waste hills, which created by coal mining industry. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, of course, the post-industrial landscape, it can be also monumental, and it is monumental because it's going to be a monument to engineering, if you want to remember, and this, even natural landscape, as long as being seen as interpreted, it's got a kind of cultural feel or cultural context. So even the forest and mountains, if they come to literature, if they become texts, discussed, interpreted, they become clearly cultural elements of culture. We have a heavy industrial region in Upper Silesia in Poland, and this is a very clearly a cultural landscape, which you can see it both as a gaze and, of course, as the cultural identity for many people, because that's, they were still proud, even if there is not much of the industrial production in many of the cases in Upper Silesia in Poland, or in Lower Silesia as well, or in rural area. There's still a very strong element of cultural identity. Let me go for a moment to the slide. I won't share it, but I want to remind myself. when I spoke about those landscapes. I can share this. So post-industrial or industrial landscape can be clearly an important element of the identity, because that's probably what people identify with, and symbolic exchange. Could be also a representation, and again, can be also seen from a different gender perspective, because the traditional heavy industry, at least, there was the male-dominated industries. So you can try to look from a different perspective of women who often stayed home or had kind of so-called light industry, which wasn't light at all. They were involved in that. And this with post-industrial landscape, you can also see with this a similar perspective as we look as any post-liminal. So crossing a border, crossing a limit from industry to post-industry. So you have to demolish some of the things because of safety. Some of them can be incorporated, like hills, man-made hills can become forest or ski slopes or whatever else they could become, or the viewing platforms. I think the Ruhr era in Germany is a very good example of those different reinterpretations of post-industrial landscape. Some of them are turned into museum. There's a very, very popular hunt of urban explorers in Poland, also in the West, who look for the old industrial plants, not really turned to museums, but looking for this kind of strange charm of closed, derelict industrial or post-industrial buildings.
I see that Simona have a question, could you briefly introduce yourself before you're talking, because we have Facebook stream and
just so that you don't feel alone. Also, thanks a lot for the presentation. It was really interesting to hear more comparisons also on how different countries deal with certain memory or the past in different ways. But in most of these case studies that you mentioned, you refer to monuments as something negative. And I was just wondering if this is linked to the region of your study, or is this for you linked to the notion of the monument per se?
Sorry, sorry, it looks like I found... I didn't think monument is something negative, so sorry for the impression I gave. I like monuments. So, like, monumentalization is good. It's a way of remembering. When I think now, yes, maybe it could have been seen as something negative, but I don't really. So that was unintentionally. I don't think that's. I think it's a part of a natural process. That okay, if we change, so some monuments has to be replaced by some others. We still have to have something to warn, to remember. We need our history. If monument were meant to to remind, advise, and warn, they still need to be. Okay, maybe I focus on post-communist monuments, and they went through reinterpretation, but the monuments, they represent societies. So each of those buildings, if they are still existing, if they were not destroyed, removed, it clearly means that society wants them to remind, advise, or warn, or something else. So I think monuments are important, I would think necessary elements of our life, and we have them around. These monuments, I rather see them as a monumental landscape because it also includes the context. If you talk only about monuments, I know most of my pictures only show the buildings. They didn't show much of the context. I try to talk about the context, but the context, spatial, temporal is very important. And I think there's those any of those monuments, if not this ones, the other monuments will be created to rebuild the past. There is this tendency to. There was one leader of the party in Poland who wanted to rebuild old brick castles in Poland that were constructed in 14th century, but fortunately he didn't succeed. But we have a newly constructed Gothic castles, I think at least 3, partly with the EU money, because they apparently give a lot of employment and anything else. They are monuments to our dreams and to our imagination of the past. I don't think it's negative. We carry our monuments in our heads, and sometimes, if we have a chance, with all this heritage resurrection, with many of the German names being rediscovered, or the German memorabilia, we've just had the big Antique Fair in Gdansk. It just came back today from Gdansk, and there were lots of German-era memorabilia, very pricey, because that's our past. That's kind of our, movable, but a kind of monument to remind us where we come from.
Do we have questions? If not, I have one more. Well, could we turn to one more problematic which we described in our interest of the residency? It's environmental issues, and it's interesting to ask you about landscape or urban expert. So you're also working with municipalities. You also work with as a consultant of urban developers, and it's interesting to ask you about this the growth theory, especially in our Eastern European context, because during the residency we several times we have this discussion on non-production and artistic responsibility in this environmental crisis times. So what do you think about this, the growth movement, and how we can implement the key points of this theory in Eastern European context, in Ukraine and in Poland?
Yeah, this is a very difficult question, because I do not see many bridges between monuments and monumental landscape and environment, because from my perspective, most of the environmental actions are not very monumental, let's say. They are like everyday vernacular actions. So I don't see them as much of the monumental, representational, historical elements, but we could see there's a growing concern, especially with municipalities, because they were very much affected, especially with heavy rains. So because of that, there was like a cold shower. So they said, okay, we have to do something for the environment. So the first thing, which is very visible in many of our cities, they've stopped cutting grass. So we've got the urban meadows of different flowers, and apparently there's much bigger capacity to keep the water. So some cities also start to make the water management system, municipal water management system. So try to keep the rains or control, limit the floods if to the extent when it's possible, to green up areas, of course. And It's also other thing which is very clear, very recent transformation, at least in Poland, is the involvement of media. For last, I think, 2 years, our televisions, during their weather forecast, they also show the quality of air in major cities. So it clearly raised the consciousness of people that, okay, we've got dirty air. And we watched it. I mean, I don't have a television, but many of the people who watch television, they watch weather forecast. So then they see, okay, we've got bad air, and we see this every day. So we should do something about it. So there is clearly a growing consciousness of on between the local societies, and on the management structure on local governments. It's usually related with water management and greening up areas. So I can see this aspect of changing landscape. So there's lots of new parks being revivaled, opened for access, and there are some measures to limit air pollution in cities, at least from the municipal perspective.
Do we have any questions? Yeah, you should.
Maybe one more.
Yeah.
It's also interesting. It was also interesting to see also from your talk on or perceive how politics actually capitalize on this kind of common memory or cultural memory for either joining or separating societies. And you showed also this kind of examples of rebuilt structures, reinterpreted structures like castles and palaces, like trying to fill in some phantom limb of this great past. So there is this very important maybe question when also evaluating heritage or assigning some to monuments or not, is and the great question is not to be or not to be, but to remember or to forget. And how should one do this? Is it possible to do this? Would you have any, I don't know, examples, or what's your take on this?
I'm not a big fan of reconstructions, of rebuilding of how it was. If it was destroyed, it was destroyed. So I think the resources should be spent on something more needed than reconstruction to the previous state. Even with Notre Dame de Paris, I don't think it should be rebuilt to the form how it was more or less done by Viollet-le-Duc in the end of 19th century. This is very recent movement, probably started in late 19th century, but definitely after the First World War, when some Belgian cities, especially Ypres or Ypres, was rebuilt or reconstructed to more or less form how it looked before the war with the German contribution money. But I mean, it's kind of against the natural development of history. Natural development was that every generation added something new. If you look at the old churches in Rome, you could see, or in Italy, you could see some of the Greek elements, some of the early medieval, Renaissance, Baroque, 19th century, and maybe 20th century. There's kind of a natural process. But now I think it's related with this very Foucaultian institutionalization, when the institutions has been created to be a gatekeepers of heritage, national heritage institutions, so they became very strict. They were experts, the gatekeepers, who said, no, you can't reconstruct this house. I own a 250 years old wooden house. Fortunately, it's not listed. And I was actively a part of it. That house is not listed because I'm not sure if I want to renovate it, and definitely not to the form it was. It is a big house, but not very functional. They had 4 huge walk-through rooms. who want to live in a walk-through rooms? In Versailles, there's a walk-through king's bedroom. We don't want to live in a walk-through bedrooms, even if we are kings, not anymore. We want to have an ensuite with a private bathroom. I'm not really fond of this rebuilding. We see this in many cases in Poland, Berlin, Frauenkirche. Okay, now the castle in Vilnius. There are a number of churches, but it's very recent. I mean, normal process was that, okay, it was destroyed, build something kind of up to date that will meet different needs of different people. So build a monument of yourself. Don't copy of the image of the past that you had in your mind. I know there were some discussions during the discourse how the Notre Dame de Paris should be reconstructed, and they've got more or less original designs from medieval times, so they could kind of go back, but they've decided to go back to the Viollet-le-Duc 1880s plan. Okay, but that's again, I wouldn't do this if I was advisor of the mayor, so I would advise against. But if everybody else were to do this, landscape represents the strong groups. So the politics is also us. When I was the advisor, I had some influence on the mayor up to the point. Eventually, mayor said yes or no. It was his decision. He took responsibility. And sometimes there were bigger groups of private people who wanted to renovate buildings like this. We have in Gdansk different phases of rebuilding after the war. So in late 40s and 50s, the main street is more Renaissance than it was before the war, because there's this creep of all of the 19th and 20th century decorations. Then in 1960s and 70s, there were more simplified forms of the Dutch house or the Hanseatic house. In late 1990s, they were trying to make copies of the pre-war photographs, which I think are pretty ugly buildings. And then now they say, okay, it's up to the developer. You can build something modern, but you have to keep the roofs and the shape. So there are some very nice modern constructions. One developer wanted to build a copy of what it was. It's up to him, and becomes more natural process. So sometimes the very strong institution, it kind of limits us. It's in many of the aspects. So institutions are good, but if they become too strong, it's more difficult for creativity, and sometimes it blocks. I had a friends who were relatively wealthy or quite wealthy. They wanted to build a very nice modern house on a hill outside Stuttgart in a bourgeois district. It took them, I think, 2 or 3 years in the court to fight for the design, because every other house in this district is a red roof, white facade, and they wanted to have a concrete and glass. It is really a modern house. I've seen it in a BBC program about modern houses in Europe. You can't see it from the street, so it's not like it's spoiling the value of the neighbors. But if the institutions, I think it kind of limits the creativity. So I think some of the freedom, that's how our cities were built. The buildings were different. Okay, again, I speak too much.
We have comments from Alina Lupo. Would you like to comment?
Sure, I can, if the rain allows me, because apparently there's a storm right now. No, I just, sorry for the darkness.
Say a few words. Where are you and short introduction. Can you say a few words? Where are you and who are you?
Yes, I'm a conceptual artist. I live in Amsterdam and I come from Romania. And apparently there's 75 kilometers per hour winds right now in Amsterdam, so I'm bracing talking about climate change. No, I just mentioned the fact that maybe with the examples that you gave with like the meadows and letting grass grow and so on, which is something quite nice. Maybe it's a matter of reframing the idea of what a monument actually is, because a monument tends to be like a human action on, like you build a monument as a human rather than allow nature to build itself as a monument. So maybe like even the parks, which are not necessarily like just nature, but they are still human made, but they're maybe a bit more like natural at a certain point. So you just start a process and you make a park, you frame a park, and you could rename that as a monument instead of a statue that lives that is built in a park. Maybe you consider a meadow a monument, and in fact, I mean, there are natural monuments, like natural protected monuments all throughout the world, but maybe we don't necessarily view them as monuments. So that should maybe change in our perception.
Yeah, like I have a little problem with this monument issue, but I agree with you. I mean, the green areas can be a great examples of cultural landscape as such, if the meaning is added. So the meaning is crucial, and many parks, squares, urban meadows, they have a great meaning for the local population or for the whoever else coming. So if you add the meaning or significance to a square or a park or a river, that's clearly a cultural it becomes a cultural landscape with this layer of meaning. So of course, but with monument, I thought we had a discussion before how you understand monument. I mean, when I found this definition of monument, which was most related with the past, as something to be kind of reminded with extra meaning. So then I'm not sure if a newly built square outside my home can be called a monument. But on the other hand, if we start to call it a monument, that's the other concept. It becomes monumental.
I'm just wondering whether it would be like a monument to us not going extinct somehow. Like if we allow nature to take over a bit more, and that's already a layer of meaning to say that this is our kind of like our way out of this.
Yeah, during the residency we have a structure that we are working in 4 labs, and one of those is garden lab, and it's different participants from different time zones, and now we have interesting task how to plant a common garden from different places. And maybe one example which inspired us, it's Joseph Beuys, German artist, which called his project in the Documenta social sculpture, I guess. Garden was a social sculpture, so it's this monument term is really close to this park and garden definitions. So, возможно, у нас есть вопросы на трансляции в Фейсбуке. Если у вас есть необходимость задать вопрос, у нас есть возможность перевести. Да, подключайтесь. Если нет, возможно, я думаю, что время для последнего вопроса. Maybe it's time for the last question, and then we can have Mariusz with us maybe next days during the residency, during the maybe morning sessions or reading group on Thursday. So anyone, maybe anyone wants to comment? Veronica, Maria.
Thank you for the lecture. Maybe I will ask you about the phenomena of post-Soviet nostalgia in Poland. Have you met some cases of this phenomena and in Poland or in Gdansk within an urban landscape? And so how do you reflect on such phenomena in Poland or in other post-socialist countries?
Okay, probably the country with the strongest post-socialist nostalgia is Germany. But for many people, okay, less and less people, but the older generation, that's the feeling that they lost their country. And there was, all the elites were coming from the West, and they took all the government. So whatever happened in Romania, Czech Republic, Hungary, Bulgaria, Poland, we did it, while in East Germany. So there's nostalgia for the lost country. But there's a very clear element of the appreciation is the architecture or landscape, especially now when we have a big development boom and lots of architecture which is being constructed is the moderate quality, market-oriented, very dense. And some of we have few examples of the protected by law surrealist architecture, starting from Warsaw, but also in Krakow and many of the other places, a few at least. And then there is a growing number of appreciation of 1960s and 1970s buildings and architecture. So there was recently a book published on socialist architecture of Poland, 1945, 1989. It's also showing a growing interest of that. So I'm not sure if I would call it nostalgia. It's probably, in Poland was probably a bit different because before the transformation in 1989, we had a very deep economic crisis. So 1980s were difficult with no food practically and electricity cuts. And we had the martial law in 1980, 81 till 83. So the decade before is not much to be remembered nicely for most of the people. So I remember we had coupons since late 1970s to 1989 for sugar, meat, shoes, copybooks, cigarettes, chocolate, almost everything was for coupons. And often you couldn't buy, the shops were empty. So there is a limited nostalgia, let's say, for this. But in the architectural, yes, because some of the designs were interesting, were nice, were of a good quality.
Okay, thank you. And maybe one more question. Is this really hard to protect Soviet cultural heritage in Gdansk? Is there so?
There's a tiny difference that many of us are very keen on saying that we are post-socialist, not post-Soviet. So this is the kind of little semiotics, but it's also very interesting when people from the West, they call this post-communist countries. So if you see a book saying post-communist landscapes, that's written by somebody from the West. I wrote a book about post-socialist cities because I was from the East. So for me, the post-Soviet and post-socialist, there's a slight difference. Yet there is a problem because it's new and it's hard to protect the building which is 40, 50 years old. And it's very often privatized, modernized, isolated. We had a few very nice examples that has been modernized in 1990s and early 2000, and they've lost all its architectural value in this sense. So they are living buildings. So this is a kind of natural process of living the building. Let me just turn the lights on because it's getting darker here. Yep. So that's the major problem. We don't have 1950s buildings. It was easier to make the monuments like there was in Warsaw or in Krakow, while the 1970s, there was art historian who was keen on, keeping some of the buildings, but they were privatized and modernized A very nice restaurant called Crystal, sold as a bank. Now you don't see much of the original design. So that's again living landscape. So the best protected landscapes, they are in the places without much of the development. Gdansk, unfortunately, from this perspective, is kind of booming. So there's lots of money coming, lots of transformation and modernization. If you look at the old historical cities like Venice or, I don't know, Amsterdam, Venice is so nice because since the collapse of the Republic, there was nothing there. There was no money. If there was a money in 19th centuries, it would have been rebuilt like Milano. Like Milan has no really old town because the city was booming for centuries, or even Rome. So probably in the kind of less developed parts of Poland, you can find some of the buildings if they didn't collapse. But in Gdansk or in Warsaw or in Krakow, there's not much left, unfortunately.
I understand. And maybe one more, and this is a very short question about what do you think about Lenin monuments fall in Ukraine?
But, I think it was late, but I think it's all needs time. I know the one in Lviv was moved very early. I think in 1990 probably or 91. I think there's a Taras Shevchenko monument now in this location or somewhere there. But in central and eastern Ukraine, they're still there because it wasn't a problem for people when it became a. So this is this kind of landscape of becoming. At one moment of social, historical, cultural transformation, Lenin started to symbolize evil, bad. That's from the kind of scientific perspective, it would be nice to maybe label them as a kind of monument of the previous era. But on the other hand, I'm happy we don't have the monuments of Stalin or Dzerzhinsky because I don't want to see them really. Or maybe in a sculpture park. I was in a Gorky Park in Moscow and there were a number of monuments. And it was the same in the Gruta Park in Lithuania. So that would be the place. But for years, for decades, it wasn't a problem for Ukrainians that the city was called Dnepropetrovsk. And then suddenly Petrov became a bad guy, so had to, leave the city name. So now it's only Dnipro. Dnipro is still okay, but Petrov is not. So, but that's kind of I could see as a natural process when people wanted. There was a kind of general consciousness, and I think there's also a lot of name changing in different locations and streets. We had this in 1989 and 1990. Then we had the other wave when the right-wing party came to power. So they thought any left thinkers and socialists, even 19th century socialists, they were considered as bad guys because they were socialists. So there was the other wave of cleansing. I think it's a natural process when people, I think the vast majority didn't want to have Lenin on the major square. I think it's maybe in a museum or maybe being melted. Let it go. Let him go.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, if nobody has a question, so we can stop here. Well, I think it was amazing conversation, and thank you for your thoughts and ideas. Maybe we can continue this Q&A session during the next events in more closed formats. So thank you for being with us, and thank you, Mariusz, for this talk. It's interesting. Is it possible to share your presentation with the participants, or?
Yes, but I'm afraid. I mean, the only problem is that I uploaded my photographs, which some of the new ones are very heavy. So I can send it probably without pictures. I'm afraid. It's not that I want to save them, but they are really heavy pictures. So I can share it without photographs. Because it will be easy. I can put it as a PDF because I think it's 30 megabytes or something. I think it's not emailable. So if that's okay for you without pictures, I can do this today or tomorrow morning.
Anyway, we have this video stock on our Facebook page.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can easily send the text, so there's no problem with text. The only problem with picture is that they are very heavy, and I don't really know how to make them lighter on my presentation. So I just copied them from my camera, and then on every new phone, the pictures become bigger and bigger.
Thank you. Have a good evening and be safe. Yeah, bye.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, and thanks for your questions. It looks like a very interesting project. I wish you all the best. If you have some questions, you can contact me. Some joy in the background that it's over. Have a good evening, you too, and bye. Bye-bye.